Hi, listeners. Welcome back. We're between seasons. So as usual, we're spending a couple of weeks just digging through the archives, pulling up some relevant content, giving you a preview of season 9 and some of the tools and best practices that we're seeing work with our allies in training. So today's conversation I wanted to have is about instant gratification and why it might be holding your diversity efforts back. So we know from the work that we're doing and the folks that we've had, the great guests that we've had on this podcast, that allies stay in the diversity game long term. They are not just here when it's cool. They're not showing up at the protests and making the donations just when it's in the news cycle. They know that it's not a check the box. It's not a one and done. It's not a sprint. It is a marathon. So it means the work never ends. And diversity and inclusion efforts will go long beyond our lifetimes and even our children's lifetimes for generations to come. With that said, I think that can be pretty daunting. There has to be a starting point, even if there's no ending point. It's never too late to start on the journey. And once you're on the journey, it's all about staying on the journey and bringing other people into the journey to join. So amidst, this surge in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, with the added challenge of talent retention in a hybrid work environment, and on top of that, the long overdue social and racial justice movements, organizations are really wrestling with what the correct starting points are for them. And the temptation to increase recruiting and hiring efforts for diverse talent, it's very real. And I can understand it. I can empathize with it. And it's a cautionary tale. Because diversity does not work without inclusion. Despite having really good intentions, a lot of times great intentions, simply going out and trying to find diverse talent will not generally lead to better outcomes for organizations. We saw this, summer of 2020. The amount of opportunistic recruiting and hiring, the oversimplification that I can just go to an HBCU and recruit talent, even though I've never been on campus before. Certainly, they'll be jumping to work for us. It's just simply not true. And the short-term representation numbers increase marginally, but there's not a deeper commitment. If there wasn't a deeper commitment to the inclusive work environment where everyone really wants to be there and feels fully respected and seen and heard and feel that sense of belonging, then I would say focusing on talent, diverse talent recruiting and hiring is actually going to make your problem a bit worse. So a few problems: instant gratification. Our brains are wired to want things now, right? And there's that famous marshmallow study that was done with children many years ago. It's been reproven over and over again where they give a kid a marshmallow now or give them more, marshmallows later, right? What do kids often do? They take the one that's guaranteed, that's now in their hand versus waiting. But they actually found better outcomes for folks that waited for the marshmallows later and benefited more. But that instant gratification, I want this certain thing in front of me, is very human. So if you struggle with that, it's okay. But we also need to acknowledge this because this is the tempo problem with diversity. Results are often long-term with diversity. So we lose focus. We live in a society, a culture where short-term results are rewarded, oftentimes more so than long-term results. You just look at the stock market as an example, the short tenure of CEOs, and the focus on what are you doing for me now versus where are we going together in relationships long-term. And, you think about what this means for this next generation of little allies, because the latest diversity and inclusion forecasts show we're centuries away from equality, okay? From gender equality to racial equality, we're centuries away. And I think as organizations, it's easy to kind of check out and say, well, what's happening right now? To be honest, despite my dismay with the current situation, organizations can get more out of their people by maintaining the status quo and appealing to what works in the short term. The runway for that behavior, though, is limited. Demographics are shifting in our country and globally, and the risk of irrelevance is very high long term. There's likely to be a wake-up moment sooner rather than later for organizations that aren't focused on diversity and inclusion long term. So don't you want to be ahead of that curve versus scrambling? The excuse I hear most often is we can't find diverse talent. Have you heard this before? All too often, it is the excuse for not being able to recruit and hire diverse talent successfully. It's more likely to be said by the majority group, white, straight, male, cisgender, able-bodied folks. And at its core, it's very problematic because if we believe it's hard to find, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we will almost always look for evidence to confirm that that's true. And that's called confirmation bias. However, if we shift that belief to finding diverse talent and believing it's possible, perhaps we'll do things differently to get more diversity. And then we'll look for possibilities rather than limitations. A shift in mindset might increase our willingness to try different approaches, like recruit from different colleges and universities, post in different job boards, ask our diverse talent for referrals and reward on that, change our language and job descriptions and interview guides to make sure it's really inclusive. And one of my friends shared an analogy with me a few years ago, and I love it. If you fish in the same pond and you don't catch fish, do you blame the fish? Or do you look at your technique and how you attract the fish? Similarly, if you're a gardener, you plant a flower, you don't blame the flower for not growing. You think about what you could do differently to improve the soil of which the flower can grow. The same goes for diverse talent. We don't need to blame the talent that's not attracted to us, right? Focus on what you can be doing to create an environment where diverse talent wants to work. Last cautionary tale here with instant gratifications is, yes, decisions do take longer with diverse teams. That is about the only negative thing I can find out there. We get more innovation, better business results, higher revenues, profitability. Everything's good. The one little slippery slope to this is, when you have different people sitting around the table, you don't have groupthink, right? So you don't just go on the easy button solution. You dig deeper, you find more holistic solutions to bigger problems. So think about the most diverse team you've been a part of. There was probably a lot more storming than norming, right? You didn't have as much in common. And probably, varied perspectives. There probably wasn't as much groupthink. Probably valued divergent thinking over convergent thinking. All these factors come into play to enhance the richness of the conversation and is more likely to generate potential solutions versus shortcutting decisions to our gut instincts and what's always worked before, aka the status quo. But the similarity bias that we face when we're around like-minded folks and people with the same background as us, we risk being out of sync with customer needs and community needs if we're not mirroring and matching that inside our organization and in our decision-making processes. So consider, some of these ideas, chase the innovation and skills that you're missing on your team versus practicing risk aversion. That's huge. We're so risk averse. Hiring inclusively isn't about quotas. It needs to be a disciplined approach to focus on skill sets and ensure your sourcing is disciplined. Get rid of that subjective criteria. Make sure it's objective. Ask your current employees what resources they need for their well-being and make sure they feel included in trying to make others feel included, especially welcoming others to the organization or participating in the hiring and recruiting processes. Your about page on your website is really, really important real estate. Show diversity transparently. Don't use stock images. Don't pretend something you're not. Use genuine, authentic messages there to show that you're really walking the talk with diversity and inclusion, that this isn't just an opportunistic ploy. Because people are getting really good at deciphering that and figuring that out, who's authentic and who's in this for the long haul. So resist the instant gratification, resist short-term over long-term as an ally. You'll be better for it. Thanks again for being a supporter and to listening to some of our bonus episodes. We'll be back with season 9. Excited to dig in with DEI folks inside organizations with real tools, strategies, and case studies that you can learn from on your own diversity journey. Thanks, listeners.